Okay, I'd like to welcome you all to this very exciting event that we're hosting by the Sustainable Consumption Institute. My name is Dale Southerton and I'm a professorial fellow of the Sustainable Consumption Institute and responsible for their research on sustainable consumer behaviour. I want to begin by thanking Linda McIntosh for all of her hard work in putting this together, as well as Sue Huzar, Deborah Stowe and Jane Raftery, who have also been instrumental in putting together this event. I'd also thank in advance Professors Paul Eakins and Tim Jackson, who I know are going to provide a very stimulating platform for debate. And it's interesting that this venue, which is entirely appropriate for what we're talking about tonight, is the venue where they held the temporary House of Commons during the Second World War. So this room is built for debating. And I'd like to thank all of you for coming, for braving the weather and the tube strikes. Before we start, I just want to say a few things about the SCI. For those of you who haven't heard of it, it's a new institute that's been set up in the last few years, largely through a charitable donation made to the University of Manchester by Tesco. But our research is entirely independent of Tesco, although we do use some of their data, which I will tell you a little bit about. The blurb is that the SCI is dedicated to developing and evaluating new approaches for convincing consumers, businesses and governments that it is in their interest to make environmentally responsible decisions. And we do that in a number of ways. We do events like this one, but our primary focus is on doing cutting-edge research. And our research is divided into four main areas: consumption and consumer behaviour, eco-innovation, which is particularly interested in how organisations can stimulate the development and adoption of new technologies across their supply chains, climate change and carbon, which tackles questions of adaptation and mitigation, and environmental economics, where we're particularly focused on what we call sensible climate change policy. I'm going to say a few words about the SCI's research on consumption and consumer behaviour, partly because it's the most relevant today and mainly because it's the one I know most about. Our research on consumption contributes to a growing and real concern in contemporary society, which is how can lifestyles, ways of life and habitual forms of consumption be changed in the direction of greater sustainability? Perhaps even more importantly, is how can consumption be shifted in ways that do not undermine well-being, happiness and issues of equity? And today's debate tackles head-on those questions. Our research on consumption is wide and varied. Projects that have been completed or are currently in process all aim to explore things like alternative theories of consumer behaviour, consumer motivations and marketing, the politics of indifference, implicit attitudes towards green consumption, the impacts of zero carbon retail spaces on consumer perceptions of sustainability, and comparative research on single-person households and their practices of consumption. The major research activity of this area is, however, interdisciplinary. The SCI has 3 flagship projects, and the flagship project for the area on consumption is called Modelling Consumer Behaviour. And this is a very ambitious project, which takes the core theories from the disciplines of economics, psychology and sociology and tests them against the same set of data. To my knowledge, this is the first time that anything like this has been attempted. The project is comprised of teams of economists, psychologists and sociologists, and we focus primarily on food consumption. We'll utilise Tesco's club card data and Shopper Thoughts panel data in order to examine purchasing, people's values and attitudes, and what they do with the items that they purchase. Our objective is to produce a synthetic model or models of consumer behaviour that will allow us to better understand which policy mechanisms for change are most effective in different contexts, for different products, and more importantly, for different social groups. To aid in this ambition, we will also be employing action research techniques to try out our models of behaviour change. During the course of the research, we will also explore some emerging cutting-edge ideas around consumer behaviour, including the significance of implicit attitudes and consumer moods, representations of sustainable consumption in the media and public discourse, bandwagon effects, choice architecture and nudges, the influence of social networks on behaviour, trajectories of cultural taste, and the impacts of time pressure. If you're interested in more information about the SCI, check out our website. But that's all I'm going to say about the SCI for now. So it's my pleasure and my privilege to introduce two distinguished scholars, both of whom have made fundamental contributions to the topic of our debate today. As you all probably know, Paul Ekins is Professor of Energy and Environment Policy at the UCL Energy Institute. He founded the Sustainable Development Charity Forum for the Future and has served as a specialist advisor to the Environment Audit Committee of the House of Commons and is a member of the Royal Commission on Environment Pollution. His influential book, Economic Growth and Environmental Sustainability, strikes at the heart of our debate today. And Tim Jackson, who is Professor of Sustainable Development and Director of the Research Group on Lifestyles, Values and Environment, or better known as RESOLVE, and he's also the Director of the Sustainable Lifestyles Research Group. He is the Economics Commissioner to the UK Sustainable Development Commission, and his book, Prosperity Without Growth, presents a fundamental challenge to conventional understandings of economic growth, consumption and well-being. The format of the evening is that Paul and Tim will each spend 10 minutes introducing their positions in relation to the guiding question, is economic growth, prosperity and sustainability a contradiction in terms? This will be followed by questions and answers and discussion points from the audience, which will spark, I hope, a very interesting debate. So I hope you enjoy this evening. At the end there'll be some refreshments and canapes, but for now I'll pass over to Paul.
Well, thank you, Dale, and thanks for asking me to introduce this amazingly important subject. Before I knew I had 10 minutes, I put together 35 or 40 slides, and of course that was a big mistake. So they've all gone, or most of them have gone, but I've still got 5 big questions on which I can spend 2 minutes each, and of course each of them could last at least half an hour. So let's start with the first one, what kind of growth? When I was writing the book that Dale mentioned, it became very apparent to me that many of the writers on growth failed consistently to distinguish between 3 really important but different things that might grow. The physical growth of the economy, economic growth, which economists of course measure in money terms, the growth of GDP, and growth of human welfare. Now, these things are related, but they are not the same thing, and we can expect them all to show different dynamics, and we can moreover expect the relationship between them to change over time. So when I discovered that even my great hero, the ecological economist Herman Daly, failed consistently to distinguish between the first two, I began to understand why it was I came to a different conclusion to him about the possibility of indefinite economic growth, which is the growth in money flows. Clearly, I draw your attention to the physical growth bullet point that says the indefinite physical growth is impossible in a finite physical system subject to the laws of thermodynamics. That accords with my understanding of physics, and of course I'm not a physicist, but economic growth is not the same thing. Where does economic growth come from? Spent quite a bit of the last 10 years trying to understand that, and it's clear now to me that it comes from applied knowledge and innovation, turning non-resources into resources. Fossil fuels existed well before we learnt what to do with them, and finding better ways of doing things. We are investing as no other human civilization has ever invested in knowledge and innovation. There's no shortage of renewable energy if we knew how to harness it. There's no shortage of materials if we knew how to manipulate and use them. And of course, before the Industrial Revolution, we broadly didn't know how to manipulate fossil fuels. We didn't even know they were there. And so, of course, they were not available to us for economic growth. But, and I stress that last bullet point, economic growth must be consistent with biophysical reality, and currently is not so. And there I know I share an opinion with Tim Jackson. I'm actually quite interested at this idea of a no-growth economy, because it's not at all clear to me, if that is where economic growth comes from, how we would stop it, even if we wanted to, given that we are investing so heavily in the sources of growth. So, can it be environmentally sustainable in theory? And this is where I part company from Herman Daly, and I say emphatically yes. There is no theoretical limit to the amount of money that circulates in the economy, provided you manage to achieve absolute decoupling, and I've given my definition of that there. And if we want to achieve absolute decoupling, then innovation, which is the source of economic growth, will have to be guided in that direction. So far, of course, we have not achieved absolute decoupling. Innovation is not guided in that direction. Much innovation is resource using and resource wasteful, and we continue to do that because we do not apply the policy tools which we have and which broadly we understand. Well, can it be environmentally sustainable in practice? And that obviously, for a practicing policy kind of person like me, is the key issue. And reading this slide, there is a real danger that the answer to that question is no. We've left it very, very late. If we'd listened to the Meadows report back in the early 70s and we'd started with innovation for decoupling then, we would be in a much happier position than we are now. We know that runaway climate change is now a real possibility. We know that the biosphere and biodiversity is under huge pressure. And we know that the necessary improvements in resource productivity are very large. They were very large when I calculated them in my book in 2000, and they're even larger according to the calculations in Tim's book last year, which is hardly surprising because we've made practically no progress on the practice of resource productivity in the intervening decade. But we think the biosphere is pretty resilient. We know what to do. There's been enormous experimentation and learning about the policy toolbox over the last 20 or so years. And the activity that I've been mainly engaged in over these last 10 years, modeling of trying to understand what the costs of applying these policies would be, and all the evidence that I have found suggests that these policies may reduce GDP growth. We may go from 2.5% to 2 to 1.5%, but nowhere do I find evidence that they will halt it altogether. That's more or less where I got to in this book without having done kind of the modeling, and then I thought, well, I really do need to understand further this issue of costs. And costs, despite being a four-letter word that we all think we know what it means, is actually a very difficult word, economically speaking, and it can mean lots of different things in different contexts. And as with everything in economics, economists are pretty divided about what the costs of increasing resource productivity are likely to be. I would broadly class myself as an optimist, I suppose, and have tried to look at the evidence on those 5 bullet points there, that costs can be categorized as investments, and investments, of course, contribute to GDP and its growth. There's a lot of opportunity for zero-cost mitigation. A number of resource-efficient technologies are almost on a par with the technologies that they seek to replace. Learning curve experience suggests that they will reduce in cost over time as they're implemented. And then there's the whole Porter hypothesis that by implementing resource efficiency policies, you can spur innovation, new industries, exports, and growth, all of which, of course, contribute to economic growth. But there are important pessimistic voices, partly on the ecological economics front, people like Herman Daly, people like Bob Ayres in his recent book on energy, and they tend to adopt the view taken in those last two bullet points there. So this is where the majority of the cuts fell. I was going to present a lot of slides on what I take to be the evidence of the effect of these costs of increasing resource productivity, the effects of them on growth. You've obviously got to look at them with models, because these effects are likely to work out over time and over quite long periods of time. And I've worked on energy system costs, welfare costs, GDP costs, using different kinds of models. Of course, the Stern Review did exactly the same thing, and I've put up there the conclusion to which Nick Stern came in his review, having looked at what he thought to be the evidence. And he thought that getting to 550 parts per million by the world abating carbon might cost 1% of GDP. And that's a big number, of course. It's 1% of global GDP. But what it means is that the world would reach the level of income in July 2050 that it would otherwise have reached in January 2050, assuming average economic growth of 2%. That's the kind of evidence, that's the only evidential slide that remains from my set, that plots very large numbers of studies using different kinds of economic models, abating carbon by different amounts over different periods of time, and summarize on the y-axis the GDP costs, and on the x-axis the level of carbon reduction. Well, if we think we need to reduce by 70%, you can see that overwhelmingly the majority of those model runs suggest that that might cost between 1% and 4% of GDP, but that is really a very small reduction in economic growth rates. So, these are the conclusions to which I have come on cost and growth, that the Stern Review central estimate of 1% was probably too low, but his upper range is certainly consistent with the evidence. And there's no evidence that strong action to mitigate climate change will have much higher costs or halt economic growth completely. But, of course, there are caveats. There are always caveats in such statements. That assumes that low-carbon technological development in the future is consistent with past experience, and it assumes that there are no special productivity improvements from cheap, plentiful, concentrated energy fuels, energy resources, and this, of course, is Bob Ayres' main point in his book, or that we make technological breakthroughs that achieve this in other ways. So that has left me with the conundrum: if the economic costs are low, why is carbon reduction so difficult? Of course, it is very difficult, as the policymakers in Cancun are finding. And my last slide addresses that question, but I just want to touch very briefly on this related issue of whether economic growth, and this is my fifth kind of question, whether it's desirable in rich countries, because we've had Tim's book, we've had Peter Victor's book, which have made a powerful case that it may not be desirable. Well, I've put the 5 conventional reasons why practically everyone out there thinks that economic growth is desirable, and you can see when you go through those 4 bullet points that that's a formidable political constituency in favor of economic growth. Of course, I'm familiar with the arguments that suggest that economic growth is not desirable, and I've put up 5 bullet points there: the relationship between growth and welfare, the distortion of real public policy priorities, running up against the social limits to growth, a rich literature on that, dating back, as far as I'm aware at least, to Fred Hirsch with a book of that name in 1976, and then the whole business about individualism, competitive behavior, etc. And where you come out on that yes-no spectrum seems to me to be largely a question of ideology. So, number 2, does economic growth make already relatively rich people happier? Well, the major religious traditions have consistently said no. saying that economic growth doesn't make you happy is hardly a new message, but most people don't seem to agree with them, especially many high-level proponents of those religions. If you look back in history, many leading church people have also been rich people and clearly enjoyed that. There's a huge amount of evidence that most people want to get richer. There's a lot of evidence, too, that most people imagine that they're poorer than they really are. And money is inexorably bound up with those other great aspirations and drivers of human behavior, power and sexual attraction. So I think that the Layard message that more money does not necessarily make people happier has very resonant public policy conclusions. But I continue to be persuaded that it's not a viable political message either to produce low-carbon innovation or to do anything else. And this is my last slide. The technologies for large-scale climate change mitigation are available at affordable cost. In order to mobilize them, especially on the time that we've got left, we will have to have huge investments. And this is one of the significant conclusions for the Sustainable Consumption Institute, because those investments can only mean that our consumption will have to go down within the same GDP, because, of course, investment and consumption are both components of GDP. In Victorian times, we probably saved about 40% of national income, as indeed the Chinese do now. In 2008, our savings rate in this country went negative. In other words, we weren't saving and investing anything at all along that lines. That's going to have to change if we want to have any chance at all of addressing this issue. Financing this investment will require the shift away from consumption. To do that, we will need high and rising carbon prices, and they will change lifestyles and consumption patterns. And this is most unlikely to be politically popular. I've consistently advocated that things like fossil fuels will have to become much more expensive. That means fuel duty will have to go up. That means carbon taxes. That means removing the 5% VAT rate on domestic energy. I remember the political furore that occurred last time that was attempted, and there's no evidence that life would be any different now. So, whether economic growth would result if we managed to do all these things is still not clear, and is certainly a great practical challenge, but it cannot be ruled out. Thanks.
And I'll hand you straight over to Tim. I'm going to...
Great, thank you. Can I speak from here? Is that okay?
Yeah.
Excellent. Yeah. It's not that I'm lazy and don't want to stand up. This is not a moral beauty contest. It's not any kind of beauty contest, as you can see, perhaps with the exception of my colleagues to my right. It's a profound dilemma. What we're facing actually is probably the most profound conversation of our times, in which actually the moral high ground is difficult to define, in which good and evil flee before your scrutiny, and in which, in fact, there aren't any easy answers, as Paul himself has recognized. It is essentially, and as I've set out in Prosperity Without Growth, the dilemma of growth is the most profound conversation of our times. It is something for which we have no easy solutions, for which many of the questions are counterfactual, and in which, as Paul has suggested, there are ideological issues bound up with practical and technological issues. What is the dilemma? The dilemma is that growth is unsustainable. And by this I mean 1.5 of Paul's 3 types of growth. It's clear that material growth is unsustainable. It's also clear that economic growth of the kind that we have is profoundly unsustainable. And my suspicion is, and it is broadly driven by thermodynamics, that the second half of Paul's middle proposition is also unsustainable, that economic growth is in theory unsustainable. Let me tell you why. And it is largely that economics defines itself around human activities. Thermodynamics defines activity as an energy-consuming, or to be more precise, an exergy-consuming function. You don't get activity without the flight of high-quality energy into low-quality energy and the production of entropy. It's a very, very simple thing. And so that however fast you try to run in an economic system, if that economic system entails any kind of activity whatsoever, it has thermodynamic implications which have material implications which push you ultimately towards sustainability. That's not to suggest we can't do lots of very, very clever technological things in the interim. And of course, we should do those things. But what is it actually that still drives us towards growth? Some of the things that Paul put on the list lead us to some suggestions, but the most basic one, it seems to me, is that degrowth, the opposite of growth, décroissance in the much more savoury French, is profoundly unstable, that we do not know how to make economic systems work when they're not growing. And that is a profound problem. It's something that we have to, if we are to confront the dilemma of growth, that we have to look at very, very seriously, even those of us who don't know or don't believe that it's possible to continue economic growth indefinitely. We have to accept the opposite of that proposition, that second horn of the dilemma, that degrowth, in fact, in this growth-based system, which is the irony, is profoundly unstable. And so our one response, our one riposte, our default solution to that dilemma is to cling to the system that we know. And that's a very understandable response, because at the heart of the question of profound social change lies a kind of fear. The heart of the dilemma of growth is a kind of fear. It's a fear, in fact, of a loss of civility, a loss of social structure, a loss of society itself, the loss of hope in some quite profound sense. And prosperity, the root of the word prosperity, is the Latin word for hope. And there's no doubt in my mind that the first casualty of a serious economic collapse, whether it's driven by resource scarcity or financial instability or the flight of capital or massive devaluation leading to deflationary recession, or indeed by social injustice, the first casualty of any of those collapses is going to be our own civility, our own civilization, our own social ties, our sense of community, our sense of strong social norms. The things that bind us to each other are the things that will first come under fire under the collapse of a system. So that fear of the collapse of a system is actually one of the powerful things, powerful preventing forces for people confronting the dilemma of growth. And it's a paradox, really, that actually it is that same fear of collapse that is preventing us from making the change, because we believe that this system that we have, for all its faults, is the one that will keep the wolf from the door, will keep the barbarian from the gate. It is the place within which it's possible to construct civilization, to maintain civility, to strengthen social cohesion. Growth as a lubricant of society is the hope that sits within the existing system. And so we're confronted with a situation in which the outcome of pursuing that system in the way that we do at the moment will lead us towards the very thing that we fear in terms of confronting the system and changing it. And so it's no surprise then to find, I think, that we cling to the idea that growth is possible and that we can deliver the change we need through what Paul calls absolute decoupling. I want very briefly to say why I think that's mistaken. And it isn't simply mistaken because we're not technologically clever people. The reality is we would have to be incredibly technologically clever. We would have to create technological innovation at rates of change that are at least 10 times faster than anything we have ever achieved in industrial history if we wanted to meet our carbon targets in a world that kept on growing. By the end of the century, we would actually have to have been technologically clever enough to devise a society that no longer puts any carbon into the atmosphere, but instead draws carbon out of the atmosphere. And let me just point out, in case it goes missing, that carbon is only one of the challenges that face us. The loss of biodiversity, nutrient cycles, the loss of forests, the degradation of soils, the collapse of fishing stocks. These are all systemic effects from a growth-based economy in which consumption drives the stability that we long for. So our technological capabilities would have to be enormous. But my argument doesn't rest just on assuming that we're not clever enough. In fact, I believe we are incredibly clever. All of the technologies that Paul mentioned can deliver amazing changes if we had the political will and the economic structure to put them in place. My argument is rather to ask the question, is this economic system capable of delivering that level of transformation? And I spend quite a lot of time in Prosperity Without Growth arguing precisely why it's not. It is partly not because of economic structure itself, because of the way that institutions are structured, the way that profit works, the way that capital markets work, the way that investment works as a means not to create transition as Paul would like it to do and I would like it to do, but in fact to expand consumption markets into the future. The idea of a simple shift between consumption into investment is a very, very profound change in the structure of the system. This is not how a capitalist economy works. So what Paul calls for, while still believing that we can maintain growth within that system, is as profound in some ways as what I am calling for in terms of questioning the growth of the system itself. And the second systemic element, which leads me to suppose that we're not going to achieve the change we require in this system, is the social logic that is embedded in consumer society. This is a society in which the consumption of the wonderful novelty, the innovation that the production and the economic system provides is something that we crave. It is something that we long for. We have an appetite for novelty that is driving us towards excess. Novelty is the currency of hope in the society that we have. Novelty signals the bright, shiny future that we want for our children. And it's a profound, glittering prize, but it is also a part of the driver for a system which consistently pulls materials through the system and creates the environmental damage that we're trying to avoid. So my argument is not that we are not clever enough or that we don't have the technologies. It is that we're living inside a system which is systematically driving us towards ecological collapse. And that is a very profound place to be. It is a place at which actually we have to say quite clearly that we need structural change, that this form of capitalism is no longer fit for purpose. And the policies that we're putting in place at the moment, austerity, for example, won't work either. Austerity is a policy that punishes the poor for the crimes of the rich. It's a policy in which the language of economics goes completely missing because you're not allowed, when you're not allowed to talk about spending, to talk about investment. And yet both of us agree quite profoundly that investment is absolutely vital to this new economic system. So if we were to forget that fear, if we were to start from scratch, if we were to ask ourselves what are the structural dynamics of this new system, they revolve around some pretty profound things and some pretty identifiable challenges. One of them is, as Paul suggests, investment. But as I have suggested, that is a very different form of investment. It's investment that recognizes that the most profound economic relationship is between the present and the future, and that it is the assets and our ability to maintain those assets that provide any kind of service and any kind of well-being into the future. And so when we start to think of investment that way, we have to target ecological assets. We have to target social and public goods. These are the goods that will give civility, that will give social organization, that will protect nature, that will protect our ability to have any kind of society into the future, and we have to create the structures that will invest in them. When we do that, we won't, I believe, get back growth. I'm happy to be proved wrong on that. But it does seem to me that those investments have very different performance in terms of productivity, in terms of the rate of return, in terms of the period of return, in terms of the kind of return. Is it financial or is it social and ecological? And our ability to create the incentives to make those investments depends heavily on our ability to measure those social and ecological returns and to prevent the flight of capital into short, high payback, risky investments that collapse financial markets and place enormous risk on the public purse. Investment has to be transformed and capital markets have to be transformed to achieve that. We also have to, I believe, transform our vision of enterprise. Enterprise has been built around what we might call the prerogative of capital. What is that? It is the prerogative of the owners of productive assets to distribute the surpluses in the end to the benefit of the owners of that capital. That is a model that's led to shareholder structures which are unmanageable, fiduciary duties which drive companies towards expansion faster than is sustainable even in economic terms, and which absolutely prevent economic activity from serving the social good. We actually have to construct a vision of enterprise that puts the social good, puts ecological goals, puts social goals within the mission statement of the enterprise. And we have to build legal forms, as we've begun to do, for example, in community interest company legislation, that protect, nurture, and grow those kinds of enterprise. What is the new economics? What is the economics of prosperity? It is a place where, in fact, some basic economic tenets are protected, that we invest, that we care about the relationship between the present and the future. But it's also an economics that challenges fundamental tenets within the existing economics, that self-interest will service and serve the common good is something that we must let go of. That is not the experience of the 150 years of this capitalist system in the most advanced economies. We must let go, too, of the idea of the prerogative of capital. We must build institutional structures that protect and serve the common good. We must build enterprises that serve their communities, that integrate themselves in a resource-light way to provide employment for people, jobs into the future, and resilience in the face of the potential, and we have to face this, the potential for real economic collapse from the other parts of the system. This is not a moral beauty contest. Actually, the reality is, I've known Paul for 25 years, most of the time that I've been working on these issues. And he, in fact, has been one of the leading lights in the kinds of economics that I'm describing. Some years ago, he wrote a book about those grassroots economics that could form the basis for the community social enterprise model that I'm talking about. From a personal point of view, he's someone who has eschewed car travel, who walks and cycles everywhere, doesn't holiday abroad, and is absolutely abysmal as a consumer. In fact, if we all shopped like Paul does, we would collapse the economy faster than anything that I could possibly say in favor of doing that. The challenge of that, the challenge actually of understanding that you're in the presence of someone whose value systems are completely at odds with the consumer culture that he is attempting to defend in some sense, I think should lead us more and more strongly towards the view that this is a point for serious reflection. It's a point for serious challenge. It's a time to forget about growth, to concentrate on the things that matter: jobs, resilience, community, investment in social goods, investment in ecological assets, and then to develop the economics that will give us stability and resilience out of those conditions. It's a time, in fact, to build an economics fit for purpose, and one that's capable of delivering a lasting prosperity. Thank you very much.
Okay, it's your turn now. So open up to the floor, and we already have one question. Someone's going to come round with a microphone so we can hear you.
Paul, as a former student of economics at University College London, I'm a touch perplexed by your definition of economic growth. Probably my fault, but it just seems to me that your definition of economic growth is simply about ever-increasing asset values, which is one of the big problems we have at the moment. This idea that we can keep all these housing and financial systems up in the air just by pumping out more and more money. And there also seems to be no recognition whatsoever in your explanation of the damage that the growth-based system has done so far. Then you say that the biosphere is very resilient. And I wonder what leads you to think that the biosphere could possibly be resilient when the biosphere has never had to cope with greenhouse gas emissions such as we're already emitting. Finally, you said there's no evidence of GDP growth in relatively rich countries not making people happy, but that seems to fly in the face of the evidence from places like from Denmark, which is the only country in Europe to have experienced increasing happiness rates and has the flattest income distribution in Europe.
So small question. Paul, you want to take that?
Yep, fine. The definition of economic growth is, as I understand it, GDP, which of course is a flow of money. It's not an asset value. Assets are supposed to have a value according to their productivity and according to the desirability that people have. Now, one of the characteristics of capitalism, of course, has been that we have had bubbles and assets have acquired unsustainable values and have therefore collapsed in value. But that is not a necessary outcome of economic growth. It is a result of greed and our failure to regulate the economy properly. And it seems to me perfectly feasible to imagine that as an intelligent species, we might get a hold on how to regulate the economy so that money is sound, money flows, and as we innovate and become cleverer at doing things, the amount of value that we create increases, and that is reflected in economic growth. I certainly do recognize that there are enormous growth-based damage to practically every aspect of the natural world, which is hardly surprising because we don't value the natural world in any way at all. This is recognized all the way back to Pigou in the 1930s. We decided to call the natural world an externality, which is an absolutely extraordinary concept when in fact the natural world is the foundation of wealth creation. It's the economy, in a sense, that's the externality on the natural world. So there's a fundamental conceptual error. But even within that conceptual framework, Pigou recommended that we should seek to internalize environmental damage. And for a whole variety of political economy and other reasons, we failed to do that. But had we done that, then we would not be in the position that we are today. And I mean, on absolute decoupling, very important experiences that we've had with some things when we really put our mind to it. Sulfur dioxide emissions, for example, in the rich world have fallen by over 90% since 1970, the kind of decoupling we need to see from carbon, as a result entirely of policy. That's not happened through the normal activities of capitalism at all. That's happened through policymakers deciding through democratic societies that we don't want sulfur emissions. And I remember all the way back to the acid rain issues back in the 1970s, the great popular campaigns that were waged of that. I obviously didn't express myself clearly on the subject of happiness. What I said was, I'm aware of the evidence. I think some of it requires careful interpretation, that economic growth over the last 40 or so years has not made rich countries happier. So I think that's different to what you said. I'm aware of that evidence. On the other hand, I'm also aware of a lot of evidence that suggests that people think that economic growth will make them happy, and they think that very, very strongly indeed, such that when they go to elect governments, the management of the economy for economic growth is just about the number one priority on people's minds. So that there is this kind of paradox that the evidence suggests, as religious thinkers have always said, that money won't make you necessarily happy, but people don't believe them, and they don't act as if they believe them. And that's why this is such a profound debate, as Tim was saying.
Tim, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I think too much is made of happiness. It's vastly overrated. There are interesting points. I mean, now it's obviously clearly a government priority, and we're now going to measure happiness. What the government seems to have missed is actually that we've been doing it for 5 years since the 2005 Sustainable Development Strategy recommended it. It's just that nobody's really taken that much notice of it. So it is about the priority of those measures within the context of policy, and it's also about their depth, it seems to me. A lot of the approaches to happiness as a sort of single-dimensional outcome variable that you can reliably measure are too thin, it seems to me, that one must think in terms of a kind of more nuanced sense of flourishing and well-being, along the lines of the things that Amartya Sen has articulated in terms of human well-being outcomes. And I do believe that if there were enough political will to take our capacity for measuring those variables and place them at the centre of policy, that could be an incredibly powerful tool for change.
Is that man there? Just on the third row in the middle. It's also worth noting that happiness is relative, so you always feel happier when your next door neighbour is worse off than you are.
I don't think any of this audience could demur from an awful lot of what both speakers have said, but the problem stems from the fact that we have got to state specifically what we mean by growth, what we mean by prosperity and sustainability. I agree with Tim Jackson on the issue of happiness. If you go to somebody in a concentration camp and offer to give them regular meals, they'll be a damn sight happier than they would be if they were having those meals outside. But they would be happier. But anyway, that's an aside. What I want to focus on is to suggest that this debate is to a considerable extent irrelevant insofar as we have got a far, far greater problem ahead of us, which I think both speakers would agree with, which is the declining state of the planet in terms of its habitability. When you put that into the equation, then question as to whether we have this or that type of growth, whether it is more respecting or less respecting of ecological issues, becomes beside the point. The fact is that the planet has got a finite capacity to absorb the further burning of fossil fuels. It may be that we've even gone past the point of no return, but let's assume that there is still some left. What do we do with that? Because that, it seems to me, dictates the sorts of activity that we can indeed contemplate. And without that being at the forefront of what we are doing and thinking, then what will happen is what we can already perceive, which is that the planet will carry on deteriorating. I don't think any informed person in this audience could deny, and certainly not the speakers could deny, that the planet in 20 years, 40 years, 60 years is going to be in a worse and worse state because of our inability to face up to our responsibilities. Those responsibilities need to be addressed from the perspective of the finite nature of this capacity of the planet. Now, the question then becomes, how does one share out that finite capacity? Well, progressive people talk about contraction and convergence, the contraction of greenhouse gases and convergence towards equal per capita shares. In effect, personal carbon rationing, not as a function of something that people could be encouraged to adopt and impose upon themselves, a form of rationing, but the one that is mandated by government because it won't work otherwise. We know that for sure, and we go around talking about the behavioural change and the choices that the public have and so on and so on. The reality is that it has got to be government that enforces this. Now, what comes, I'll shut up in a minute, but it's an important point I'm making, or going to make a further important point, which is what happens when one feeds into the equation an element which has been almost totally overlooked, other than in rhetoric, which is the claims of future generations on this finite resource. When one feeds into that, then the question becomes, well, how many future generations should be factored into the calculations of how to use this finite capacity of the planet, of the atmosphere to absorb further carbon rush? And the answer, of course, to all these questions is that it's got to be zero carbon, or as very close to that as possible. When that penny drops amongst the cognoscenti and the decision makers in this country and around the world, then we will be in a totally different ballgame, which sees the irrelevance of economic growth as something to pursue, whether it is or is not developed and interpreted in a more or a less progressive way. Thank you.
Thank you. And I mean, it's a very important, how do you make the penny drop is a very important question. And I think part of the importance of the debate is that at the moment, I think economic growth trumps the argument about sustainability. If this was question time, economic growth is the trump card with the audience. But Tim, Paul, do you want to add anything?
Well, I agree with Maya on the importance of limits. And I mean, to me, the three principles of change are establish the limits, fix the economics, and change the social logic, which sounds pretty simple when you say it in those terms. And of course, each one of those is incredibly complicated. But the establish the limits one has to be, I think, at the heart of a strategy of change, because in much the same way that a household actually can't really think about its long-term survival if it doesn't know what its resources are and where its limits lie. And a firm can't protect its supply chains if it's degrading natural resources faster than they become available. An economy, and indeed a planet, certainly can't expect to prosper and expect to protect well-being if it hasn't any idea, which is the reality in most of the cases. It doesn't have any idea of where the limits lie and what the implications of its existing economic structures are. So that first principle is the one that Maya is underlining. I don't think it goes far enough. To me, the heart of this is the structure of an economic system, and it is precisely because that economic system is driving in a particular direction as hard as it can go, on the basis of some quite profound principles about who we are and what we want, that we're not prepared to have the conversation about limits, that we continually confront actually a kind of conflict in government, even though it understands within its targets for climate change in the Climate Change Act that it must make progress. It's almost paralyzed from making that progress because it doesn't have an economics fit for purpose.
Cool.
Yeah, I agree with some of what Mayer says, but I fundamentally disagree with, I think, the heart of what he said, which is that whether or not we get economic growth does not matter. Because from where I'm sitting and looking at, it's the time of the Cancun negotiations, it's perfectly clear to me that the thing that is holding those negotiations back in both developing countries and developed countries, and most particularly the United States, is the fear that carbon reduction will choke off growth. And China will not do anything which imperils its 10% growth rate, because its leadership feels that its continuing sustainability as a social system depends on that. And of course we know that the US way of life is not up for negotiation, because George Bush Sr. told us that nearly 20 years ago. So it matters profoundly whether people feel that carbon reduction will or will not deliver growth. I've not really had a close policy conversation with Tim, but I imagine that we would agree that in the short term, what the policies have to do is price carbon, stimulate technological change, and stimulate behavior change. Those were the three things that the Stone Review suggested. We might disagree about the extent to which we feel we need to do all those three things, though I'm normally considered to be pretty unrealistically radical on these matters. But if we do that, there's nothing in my understanding of the way the economy works that automatically rules out growth. And that seems to me to be a really important part of the message. I also hear a whole heap of siren voices saying that by doing this we can increase growth, and that seems to me to be rather unlikely. I think we will reduce growth, but we will still get some growth. And I'm absolutely certain that if people thought we would get no growth, then they would take us to hell in a handcart, as indeed they are doing.
I'm going to take two questions now. This gentleman here and this gentleman here.
Hi, question to both of you. To what extent do you think that national and international policy is essential or necessary to make these changes? And to what extent do you think there are other strands of society, sort of business, community, etc., that could actually drive us in the direction that you're advocating?
Thanks. And we'll take this one as well.
Thank you. Just a quick point about the diff. Why do people think that having more money will make them happier, but the evidence suggests that they won't be? This isn't a paradox. I think it's just psychology. I think it's a simple matter, as Dan Gilbert said, that people are not very good at knowing what will make them happy. And I think that part of what policy needs to do is to help, and society as a whole needs to help people understand a little bit better what will make them happy. But my question is about the putting a little bit of meat on the models of this growing, this absolute decoupling that Paul Ekins has talked about, this sort of growing economy but whilst degrowing in material terms. What is this dematerialized economy? It seems like an air economy. It seems like almost a bubble economy where I guess we're spending less on products and spending more on services. But of course, services require energy as well. So we almost get this situation where I've heard people talk about and it's an economy where we have, more hairdressers, we're spending more on all these on these nice services which don't cost the environment. But it also sounds like a commodification of things which are natural to our life. It's an economy where basically we have to spend 50% of our spending of our income on cultural activities, when nowadays, we can go and see things for free. Is there a risk this will have some impacts on social justice? Is there a risk where the wealthy will be able to have culture, whereas the poor will only be able to spend their money on the material, on the material things, and there won't be any services for free anymore? And is that something that we want to be looking for?
Great, thanks. That's two questions, one on national and international policy and business, mould of businesses, and another on social justice.
Yeah, on the first question, it's absolutely clear that you need different people to do different things. Actually, what's interesting is that NGOs, communities, community groups, ordinary people are already doing things, and actually there is a huge value in the things that those people are doing, because they are, in some sense, social experiments. They're lighting the way towards different forms of enterprise, different strengths of community, different ways of people engaging. It's an agenda that actually, if there were any robust policy and real money behind it, could be well aligned with the government's big society claims. And it is already there. It's in transition towns, it's carbon reduction action groups, it's in any number of small-scale initiatives to create that change. And it's possible to create those changes. It's also possible, of course, for businesses to be proactive, for businesses to exchange a high rate of return with their investors for preferential social and ecological outcomes. Triodos Bank is one very clear example. Savers accept a lower than market rate of return in return for the fact that their savings are being used preferentially in renewable energy and energy efficiency projects. Those kinds of bargains, those new ways of structuring businesses, those new ways of structuring enterprise are absolutely critical too. I still think there is a crucial role for government. I don't believe this is a good time to remove governance from the fray and talk of the big society as a place in which we lift ourselves up by our bootlaces and don't need government anymore. It seems clear that you need strategic vision, you need institutional framework, you need regulatory structures, you need the funding to create the investments in the social goods that only government can really protect. And I suppose that brings me to Sema's question. Capitalism has always progressed through the commoditization of once social goods into private markets. And that's exactly the kind of solution that I think we're being asked to condone in a service-based economy. There's another interesting point about a service-based economy, which is that, and it exists in economic literature, it's called Baumol's disease. And it's basically the idea that services rely on human labor, they rely on people's input. So what you can't get out of service-based activities so easily as you can get out of manufacturing stuff is the productivity gains that give you back growth. So in fact, in moving towards a service-based economy, we may well be solving the growth-based issue because it gives us jobs It has low labour productivity, so there's more people employed to get the same output. It reduces unemployment. It could be quite beneficial activities like renovation, like maintaining museums and public spaces, like building community and creating cohesion. So I don't think it is all necessarily the incursion of capital into the life of the mind. But the danger that you point to, I think, is a very real one. I was in Paris over the weekend working with Peter Victor to attempt to create the kind of model of an economy that would bring these ideas into it, that bring different ideas about investment, to bring different ideas about enterprise, to challenge the assumptions about labour productivity. We went for a lovely little walk yesterday in Montmartre, and anyone who knows Montmartre knows that it's a wonderful mixture. You go up the hill to Sacré-Cœur and you visit this wonderful shrine to the most sacred visions that humans have for their own transcendence, and you find it commoditized. You find it a place in which it's impossible to get any peace and quiet, for which the building was constructed, because you're herded round various places where you can buy guidebooks and postcards and buy candles and light the candles, and you're not allowed to take photographs, and you're supposed to respect the silence, but it's okay for the people who stop you taking photographs to shout at you to stop taking the photographs. So it is no longer tranquility. And then you walk down the hill and you're on the Boulevard de Montparnasse, I forget what the name of the street is, but basically it's Pigalle, it's the red light district, and every other shop is a sex shop. And you realize that the one good thing about capitalism is it's never really attempted to distinguish between the sacred and the profane when it comes to commoditization. It's as happy with either as the food that it devours in its relentless expansion. And so it was a nice example, really, to me, of exactly what you're saying, that there is, to me, a very real danger that unless we create and focus our attention on the social cohesion and the ecological outcomes that we want, that the system itself will prevent us from achieving those outcomes, even as it continues to expand our well-being or attempt to expand our well-being.
Cool. Yeah. National, international policy, business, community, individuals, the lot. They are, of course, again interrelated, because individuals vote for national governments, businesses lobby effectively for the kind of conditions that they want. National governments are the stakeholders in international policy, and communities obviously express civil society in more or less resonant political ways. And it's quite clear to me that we've got to do all of it. And one of the extraordinary things that's happened over the last 25 years since I've been working on these issues is that in all those areas you can see the seeds of progressive change. When I started in this game, you couldn't do ethical investment. It was not possible because the financial vehicles did not exist. Social businesses, the cooperative movement was kind of in more or less terminal decline, as a producer phenomenon at least, few consumer co-ops still existing in places around the world. And there's been an enormous resurgence of these things as people have experimented and set up experiments, so that those who want to invest ethically can. And I can't imagine why they are still such a tiny proportion of the market, except that people feel that they don't offer sufficient returns, and overwhelmingly the evidence suggests people will buy ethical consumer goods provided they don't cost any more than the non-ethical varieties. So these issues of profound moral value are the things that are holding us back, that people actually want cheap goods and they want high returns from their investment, even though the vehicles and the fair trade movements and the ethical consumerism and all that now exist to an extent that was largely undreamt of 25 years ago. And I think that's something that is obviously going to have to change for politicians to take the courage that they need to take in order to make progress on this agenda. On the second question, I don't know, I've perhaps got a poverty of imagination, but it's inconceivable, really, I cannot imagine what an economy would look like after 40 years or so of the kind of rates of absolute decoupling that are now necessary. Of course, we've seen it with some things. I've mentioned sulfur dioxide, but that applies to a wide range of air pollutants, and it also applies to things like water quality. If you think how water quality has improved in rich countries over the last 40 years, we've had that kind of rate of absolute decoupling of water pollution. And in fact, our lives, most people don't notice, except that it's obviously made the most enormous contribution to our health and well-being. Now, obviously, the kinds of challenges that we're facing are far greater, and we need to get 6% decoupling per annum on carbon, on land use and biodiversity conservation and all those other kinds of things in order to avert the kinds of problems that have already people have drawn attention to. What will the society look like if we manage to achieve that 30 or 40 years from now? To be honest, I don't know, because the innovations that will come about to achieve that, they will be social innovations, they will be technological innovations, they will be consumer innovations, they will be investment innovations, but I see no reason for thinking that they should necessarily result in greater individualism or greater commodification. They could easily result in all sorts of inventions that give celebration to the social aspects of life, and whether they are in line with social justice or not will depend quite simply on the value that we put on social justice. At the moment, we don't seem to put a very high value on social justice, so society becomes more and more unequal under the operation of market forces, as everyone knows it will and does, because that's what market forces do, and we don't act strongly enough to counteract that. Unless we put that into policy, no matter what kind of decoupling we get, we won't get social justice. But we could put that into policy so that those at the bottom end of the income distribution were able more easily to live decent lives. That's a different kind of priority, which again we're not performing very well at the moment, but which I don't see any reason for thinking that physical decoupling will make those problems either better or worse in themselves.
Thank you. I think we are coming to an end. Tim, do you want to say one last thing?
Well, I just wanted to take Paul up on that last point, really, I guess, because it does seem to be quite a fundamental one. So I guess it would be a sort of question to Paul, whether what Sarah's pointing to is the existence of informal goods, of social goods, of public goods, of personal goods. And there has been a trend through the expansion of the market to remove both the quantity and the quality of those goods, to change them into private commodities and to trade them. And it's clear that there are some kinds of commodities, and I use the economic language, deliberately, which once you trade, lose their value. Sacredness, sex, spirituality, community, social ties might well be on that list. And yet, where does the dematerialized economy that continually expand find its expansion if it isn't into an incursion into those social goods? And how do you protect those social goods and the quality of those social goods and the justice that rests on having social goods in that continual expansion?
That's a final question. Well, one of the things that I did a lot of work on some years ago, and which struck me as terribly important, and it relates actually to the first question we were asked from this gentleman down the front about the definitions of economic growth, was the way in which the economic growth, as I've defined it, the growth of GDP, is systematically overstated, because what it is supposed to represent is the flow of goods and services through the economy by using money as a proxy, whereas in fact what has happened, as Tim has said, in practically all societies is that goods and services that used to be delivered without money flows become commodified and are delivered with money flows, and they get added into GDP without any recognition of the subtraction of the non-money, or the contraction of the non-money economy that has gone along with that. And Certainly there's a robust literature and academic tradition calling for some recognition that economic growth is therefore overstated as the flow of GDP, and certainly it would be very good to make some adjustments for that. Of course, one of the reasons why those adjustments are not made is that it's extremely difficult to know exactly how you might make those adjustments, but I dare say it wouldn't be impossible if we were determined enough to do it and get these comparators of things going across. It's also true that for some people, the monetization of goods and services destroys their value, but for others it does not. And this issue of values is fundamental. And the one thing that I've learnt, Tim drew attention to some of my values, the one thing I've learnt in my life is that I'm quite unusual in these values, and that most people don't seem to hold them, or at least if they do hold them, they don't express them very clearly. And as such, I think, for me, it may indeed be the case that commodifying sex, for example, would deprive it of its value. But I have a feeling there are quite a lot of people out there who don't see it like that. And I'm not entirely clear why it should be my values in matters like that which count. And of course, these things shift, and then one can become degraded in value, and one can become degenerate, highly loaded and difficult words. And indeed, our society would be classed as degenerate by many earlier societies with quite different values. But obviously, there would be many people in our society who resented that description of society. I resent having to live in a society that calls itself a consumer society, because that's not the kind of society I want to live in.
But isn't, Paul, isn't it, I mean, just to make this a bit more of an argument, isn't it then, I mean, if just speaking as Paul Eakins for one moment in time, and with the values of Paul Eakins, is it not a point to then question the value and the integrity of a system that pushes inevitably towards the commoditization of those things? Because even as it works for the people who like to have those things commoditized, it clearly doesn't work for the people who don't. And yet we're aligning ourselves with a system in which that commoditization is inevitable.
Well, I don't know about inevitable, and no one is saying that everyone has to have paid sex. The issue seems to me is whether you're allowed to have paid sex if you want to, and how society judges those people who do and those people who do not. And of course, there are whole heaps of other values that perhaps are less obvious than that, where one has seen these enormous shifts right from the beginning of the consumer society in the United States, where that basic virtue of the Puritans who went over from Britain, the basic virtue of thrift, was systematically undone and absolutely consciously undone in favor of consumption. And that's not a development that has given me a great deal of pleasure. On the other hand, I know that when I talk about my values, I am regarded as an old-style Puritan. And that's not somewhere where most people want to be. And as I am a Democrat, I feel that it's through that kind of debate, and I express myself personally about these things to anyone who will listen, but as an academic, it's not up to me to say that certain kinds of values are right because I hold them, and other kinds of values are wrong because I do not. That is something which is decided through the political process, in which I obviously participate, but which I can't have any further input into.
But still, as an academic, you could point out the places where it's likely that those values might actually simply be eroded because of the direction the system is travelling in. So we may not end up with those choices. In fact, a lot of the literature around consumption is, although pitched as a system which provides us with choice, which delivers us with choice, actually suggests a variety of different kinds of lock-in, ways in which is the temptation in front of us, and sex is only one example of that temptation, actually prove very, very powerful motivators in the hands of corporate interests that will benefit from them. And that if you create the structure that allows, that facilitates that, and that systematically at the same time removes the space for social goods, for public goods, as non-commoditized goods, then you are simply removing the choices that you personally would make and value, and many other people would too, from the future of society.
Well, it's not me who's removing those choices. It's society deciding to move in certain sorts of directions, many of which I do not like. No, I'm not supporting it. Absolutely not. Many of which I do not like, but which society clearly does like and decides to go there. And as an objective observer of the scene, which is what I am in my professional life, I have to recognize what seems to be going on and what kinds of progress might be made for a broader human welfare, which undoubtedly depends on getting carbon emissions under control and a whole range of other environmental issues, undoubtedly depends on that, and what kinds of policies might be feasible within the world in which we live, rather than the one in which I might like to live.
I'm going to stop. Good. Yeah. I mean, the next SCI public debate is the virtues of paid sex.
Indeed.
But if you want some free canapes, if you've still got time, there should be some in the main room where you came in. I'd just like to thank you all for coming in and joining in what's been a very interesting session, and to thank Tim and Paul again. Thank you very much.
Should be on the